A German major stands in what is left of a city. Behind him, centuries-old church towers are crumbling into the streets. His men are hollow-eyed with hunger. Ammunition crates sit empty. Outside the shattered windows, the low rumble of American tank columns rolls in from every direction like slow thunder. The war is not just lost, it is over. Every officer in Germany knows it. Every soldier in the streets knows it. But when the messenger arrives carrying George S. Patton's ultimatum, surrender now or face total destruction, the German commander does something that stops the room cold. He refuses. He straightens his dust-covered uniform, looks the American officer in the eye, and gives his answer with absolute calm. If he wants this city, he will have to come and take it. When that message reached Patton, he didn't rage. He didn't pace. He didn't even raise his voice. He smiled, because George S. Patton had been waiting his entire life for an enemy exactly like this. What followed would become one of the most brutal urban battles American forces fought on German soil. And when it was finally over, when the smoke cleared and the last shot was fired, Patton would stand face to face with the man who had refused him, and the words he spoke in that quiet room would cut deeper than any artillery shell. They would be remembered long after the war ended, long after both men were gone. Patton was not a general you admired from a distance. He was one you feared up close. He drove to the front lines himself in an open jeep, wearing a lacquered helmet and ivory-handled revolvers, the kind of weapons a gunfighter carries, not a general. He screamed at soldiers who weren't fighting hard enough. He once slapped a hospitalized man suffering from combat exhaustion, called him a coward, and nearly had his entire career destroyed for it. Hello, my beautiful family. If you're listening to this story, please do me a favor and subscribe to my channel. It only takes a second, but means the world to me. Also, comment where you're watching from below. Now, relax and enjoy this story. He didn't apologize. He believed that hesitation was a form of death and that his job was to cure men of it, by force if necessary. By the spring of 1945, Patton's Third Army was the most feared fighting force on the Western Front. After D-Day, they had torn across France like a blade, punched through the German lines at the Battle of the Bulge, when every other commander was retreating, and were now driving deep into Bavaria at a speed that left supply lines struggling to keep up. His tanks captured towns before the Germans even had time to destroy their own bridges. The Nazi High Command issued an internal directive that spoke for itself. Avoid Patton. Retreat before him. Do not engage under any circumstances. But not every commander received that order in time, and some were too proud, too hardened by years of slaughter on the Eastern Front, to follow it, even if they had. His name was Major General Ernst von Klauer, a decorated Heer veteran who had survived some of the worst fighting the Second World War had produced. He had served on the Eastern Front when it was still possible to believe in victory. He had watched entire divisions disappear into the Soviet winter. He had survived the kind of campaigns that broke lesser men in weeks. What he brought back from the East was not hope. It was a particular kind of stubbornness, the deep, quiet conviction that a soldier holds his position until he is ordered to leave it, or until he is dead. By March of 1945, von Klauer was in command of a mixed force of Wehrmacht regulars and SS troops defending Aschaffenburg, a historic Bavarian city on the Main River, roughly 40 miles from Frankfurt. The city sat at the intersection of bridges, rail lines, and highways that Patton's Third Army needed to continue its drive into the German interior. It was, strategically, exactly the kind of city a retreating army could not afford to hold, and an advancing army could not afford to ignore. Then came the order from Berlin. Aschaffenburg was to be declared a Festung, a fortress city. It would be defended to the last man, the last round, the last breath. Retreat was forbidden. Surrender was treason. Any officer who abandoned his post would be court-martialed. Any soldier who raised a white flag faced summary execution. Von Klauer received his orders, and he intended to honor them. On March 25, 1945, lead elements of Patton's forces reached the outskirts of Aschaffenburg. The American commanders expected it to go quickly. At this stage of the war, most German cities were surrendering within hours, sometimes without a single shot being fired. German soldiers were surrendering in columns, desperate to avoid Soviet captivity. The arithmetic of the war was obvious to anyone with a map. A patrol was sent forward under a white flag to deliver the standard surrender demand. They were met by a German officer who listened to every word without expression. Then he delivered the garrison's reply, "Aschaffenburg will not surrender. The Führer has ordered us to fight to the last man. Tell your general he is welcome to try." The order arrived from Berlin on a sheet of paper that should have felt heavier than it did. Aschaffenburg is hereby declared a Festung. It will be defended to the last man, the last bullet, the last breath. Any officer who retreats without authorization will be shot. Any soldier who surrenders will be hanged. It was signed, as so many death sentences were in those final months, in the name of Adolf Hitler. Von Klauer read it once, folded it, and set it on the table without a word. The men around him said nothing either. By the spring of 1945, orders like this were no longer surprising. They were simply the shape of the world they lived in, a world where Berlin still issued commands, as though Berlin were not itself burning. To understand why von Klauer obeyed, you have to understand what the Eastern Front does to a man. He had served there during the worst years, the years when entire German divisions were swallowed whole by the Soviet winter, when retreat was measured not in miles, but in the number of men who survived it. He had stood at Stalingrad's edge, close enough to feel its gravity. He had watched officers he respected, capable men, experienced men, crack under the weight of it. Some from Soviet artillery, some from German courts-martial. He had not cracked. What survived in him instead was something quieter and far more dangerous than ambition, an unshakable belief that a soldier's first obligation was the order in front of him, not the strategic picture, not the survival of his men. The order, it had kept him alive. It had kept him advancing when others stopped. It had earned him his rank, his decorations, his command. And now, in a Bavarian city on the main river with American tanks, massing on three sides, it was the only thing he had left to hold on to. There were officers in his command who understood the mathematics of the situation. Junior officers who had looked at the maps, counted the ammunition, weighed the casualty projections, and come to the only reasonable conclusion. They brought their concerns to von Klauer quietly, carefully, the way men raise objections when they already suspect the answer. He dismissed them without anger, without drama. "We have our orders," he said. "That is the end of it." What he did not say, what no one in that room said aloud, was that the punishment for disobedience was not just death. It was disgrace, not only for the officer, but for his family, his name, everything that survived him. Pride, duty, and fear had wound themselves together so tightly inside him that he could no longer tell where one ended and another began. He gave the order to fortify, to hold every street, every building, every doorway. Outside, the rumble of Patton's advance grew louder. The decision had already sealed the fate of the city. While von Klauer fortified his ruins, George S. Patton was doing what he had spent his entire life preparing to do. Moving forward, His Third Army had been in near constant motion since the breakout from Normandy the previous summer, cutting across France at a pace that confused even Allied commanders, let alone German ones. He didn't ask permission to advance. He advanced and then informed his superiors. His tanks captured bridges before demolition charges could be set. His infantry seized towns before German commanders finished writing their defense plans. Supply officers scrambled to keep up. Patton didn't slow down for them either. He had a theory about war, and it was simple. Speed was armor. Hesitation killed more men than bullets. The army that kept moving was the army that kept winning. His men feared him in the way soldiers fear a force of nature, not with hatred but with the specific, clarifying terror of a man who will accept nothing less than everything you have. He appeared at the front lines without warning, riding in an open jeep, polished helmet gleaming, ivory-handled revolvers on both hips. He was not inspecting. He was watching. And if he found a man who wasn't fighting hard enough, an officer who was hesitating, a unit that had stopped when it should have pushed, he made his feelings known in language that left no room for interpretation. The German High Command had taken note. Internal directives warned their commanders explicitly, do not engage Patton's Third Army. Retreat before it. Cede ground rather than invite a confrontation. It was not an admission of weakness. It was, in its way, a rational response to something that did not fight by conventional logic. But von Klauer had not retreated. Von Klauer had, in fact, done the opposite. When Patton received the garrison's refusal, his staff watched his face carefully, braced for the sharp edge of his temper. It didn't come. He read the message, set it down, and the expression that settled across his face was not irritation. It was satisfaction. Where another commander might have seen a delay, an obstacle, an inconvenience to be managed, Patton saw something else entirely. He saw an opportunity to demonstrate, in terms that no German commander west of Berlin could misread, exactly what resistance cost. Von Klauer was fighting from duty, from fear, from the dead weight of an order handed down by a man hiding in a bunker 1,000 miles away. Patton fought because he was built for it, because he understood, at some deep and genuine level, that he was most himself in the middle of a fight that other men wanted to avoid. He called his artillery commanders. He pulled up the maps of Aschaffenburg. He began to plan, not just a battle, but a lesson. If they want a fight, he said quietly, I'll give them one they'll never forget. The first American units reached the outskirts of Aschaffenburg on the morning of March 25, 1945. They came expecting rubble and a white flag. What they found instead was silence, the specific, loaded silence of a city that has been turned into a weapon. Streets cleared, windows dark, not abandoned, waiting. The first patrol moved in carefully, rifles up, eyes tracking rooftops. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the shooting started. Von Klauer had not wasted his time. In the days before the Americans arrived, his engineers had mined the main roads, pressure plates buried beneath cobblestones, tripwires stretched across doorways at ankle height. Snipers had been positioned in church towers and upper floors with clear sight lines down every major approach. Machine gun nests were established at street corners, protected by rubble stacked high enough to stop rifle fire, low enough to see over. Every building was a potential fortress. Every alley a potential grave. The Americans adjusted fast, the way soldiers do when the alternative is dying. They stopped using doors. They blasted holes through interior walls and moved building to building through the gaps, bypassing the streets entirely where they could. They threw grenades first and entered rooms second. They learned in the space of hours to treat every shadow as a decision. It was not enough to stop the dying. It was barely enough to slow it. Somewhere beneath all of it, the city's civilians were still alive. Thousands of them, elderly men and women, families with children, people who had nowhere to go and no way to leave, were sheltering in basements, in cellars, in the reinforced lower floors of churches and public buildings. They could feel the artillery in their chests. They could hear the walls of the floors above them, cracking, settling, giving way. They had not chosen this battle. They had simply been inside the city when the order came down from Berlin, and now they were part of it, trapped between an army that refused to surrender and an army that had been told to break it. By the end of the first day, the Americans had taken several blocks at a cost that sobered everyone who looked at the casualty reports. The Germans had lost men too. Snipers picked off by counterfire, machine gun positions reduced by tank shells, fired point-blank into building facades. But the city held. Patton received the evening's report without visible reaction. He studied the map, marked the positions, calculated what the next day would require. This was no longer a straightforward advance. Aschaffenburg had become something else, a grinding, block-by-block demolition of a city that didn't know how to stop fighting. What the Americans had expected to last a few hours had hardened into something neither side could walk away from quickly. It had only just begun. By the third day, Aschaffenburg had stopped resembling a city. What remained was a maze, a jagged landscape of collapsed facades, flooded cellars, and streets so choked with rubble that tanks had to push debris aside just to move. The smoke never fully cleared. It hung at rooftop level in a permanent grey layer, thinning slightly in the mornings and thickening again by afternoon as new fires replaced the ones that had burned out overnight. The fighting had settled into a rhythm that no soldier would ever call routine, but that all of them had learned to survive inside. The Americans moved in teams now, small, tight, efficient with their brutality. A grenade through the window. A pause, then entry. They had stopped thinking about the architecture, stopped registering that the walls they were blasting through had stood for 300 years, that the church at the end of the street had survived the 30 Years' War. None of that was relevant information anymore. What mattered was the angle of the next doorway and whether the shadow behind it was moving. German soldiers fought with the desperation of men who had nowhere to go. SS officers still moved through what remained of the command structure, enforcing the order against surrender with threats that everyone understood were not empty. A soldier captured trying to raise a white flag was found the following morning. He had not been taken prisoner by the Americans. Below all of it, in the dark, the civilians endured. Families pressed together in basements, listening to the building above them absorb what it could and give way where it couldn't. Children had stopped crying, not from comfort, but from exhaustion. Old men sat with their eyes open, hearing things they had no framework to process. They had been promised the city would be protected, that the soldiers above them were holding the line. What they felt through the floor told a different story. Patton came to the front on the fourth day. He moved through a shattered street with his usual bearing, unhurried, observant, jaw set. His staff followed at a respectful distance, saying nothing. He stopped beside a young infantryman sitting against a broken wall, helmet off, staring at the ground between his boots. "How long have you been forward?" Patton asked. 3 days, sir." Patton looked down the street. Rubble, smoke, the hollow shell of what had been a school. The soldier looked up. "Sir, what are we saving exactly?" Patton was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was low. "We're not saving the building, son. We're ending it." He put his helmet back on and kept walking. Behind him, the artillery resumed. The soldier stared at the ruins and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. This was no longer a battle, it was destruction. By the fourth day, the Germans were fighting two wars. The first was against the Americans pressing in from the streets above. The second was quieter, more corrosive, and in many ways more dangerous. It was the war happening inside the German lines themselves. The supply situation had become impossible to conceal. Ammunition that was meant to last weeks had been consumed in days. Ration crates that should have fed a garrison were stretched across too many men in too many positions, divided and subdivided until what remained barely qualified as a meal. Medical supplies were gone. Bandages were being cut from uniform cloth. Men with serious wounds were being moved to basements not to be treated, but to be kept out of sight. The officers knew the numbers. Some had known them since the second day. They said nothing. The SS moved through what remained of the command structure like a low current, not always visible, but always felt. Their function was no longer tactical. There were too few of them, and too much ground to cover for that. Their function was psychological, to ensure that the mathematics of survival never became a conversation that ended in a white flag. A sergeant in one of the Wehrmacht companies had quietly approached his commanding officer on the third night, speaking in a low voice about the ammunition count, the wounded, the civilians in the basement below them who hadn't eaten in 2 days. He was found the next morning. His death was not reported as a combat casualty. After that, certain conversations stopped happening entirely, but fear, it turned out, had its limits. On the morning of the 5th day, a group of 8 soldiers, Wehrmacht regulars, not SS, men who had fought since the opening weeks of the war, slipped out of a ruined building on the city's eastern edge and moved toward the American lines with their hands raised. They were not the last. Through the remainder of that day, small groups filtered out in ones and twos, moving carefully, watching for their own officers as much as for American rifles. Some made it, some were turned back at gunpoint, some simply disappeared in the rubble and were never accounted for at all. Von Klauer received the reports in silence. He issued a reminder of the standing order, reminded his officers of their duty, reminded them what Berlin expected. Then he went back to his maps that showed defensive lines that no longer existed, positions that had been overrun, units that existed on paper but not in the streets. Outside, the sound of American artillery was closer than it had been the day before. The city was falling from within, hollowing out quietly, steadily, one small surrender at a time, even if no one in that command post would admit it. On the 6th day, the end came, not with a dramatic last stand, but with the quiet, inevitable logic of mathematics finally asserting itself. American forces had closed every exit. To the north, infantry units had pushed through the last defended streets and secured the river crossings. To the south, tank columns had sealed the remaining roads hours before dawn. What had been a siege was now something smaller and more final, a tightening, a compression, the last breath being pressed slowly out of something that had refused to stop fighting long past the point of reason. The German defensive line, what remained of it, did not break all at once. It dissolved. Positions that had held for 5 days simply went quiet, not overrun, not destroyed, abandoned. Men slipped away from their posts in the darkness, leaving behind weapons they no longer had ammunition for, equipment they could no longer carry. Some moved toward the American lines. Others moved toward the cellars, stripping their uniforms, hoping to disappear into the civilian population and walk out the other side of the war as someone who had simply survived it. The SS officers who had enforced the no-surrender order were nowhere to be found. They had been among the first to leave. What von Klauer had called a fortress had become a ruin populated by exhausted men who no longer knew what they were defending or why. The heroic last stand, the image that Berlin's orders had conjured, the noble sacrifice for the fatherland, that was supposed to mean something, had no place in the reality of these streets. There was no glory in the rubble, no honor visible in the faces of the wounded men lying in basement corridors. No narrative that made the past 6 days cohere into something worth the cost. There was only the smell of smoke and the sound of American boots moving closer. They found von Klauer not at his command post, not at the front of his remaining lines, but moving through a shattered building on the city's western edge, on foot, without his staff, his uniform stripped of its insignia. He was not wounded, he was not cornered, he was attempting to disappear. The man who had refused surrender, who had straightened his uniform and looked an American officer in the eye and delivered his defiant answer without hesitation, was taken into custody without resistance. He said nothing when the handcuffs were applied. He looked at the ground. Around him, Aschaffenburg smoldered. The church towers he had used as sniper positions were gone. The streets he had mined and fortified were held by the army he had refused. The city had fallen. And now, stripped of his rank and his pride and the orders that had given both of them meaning, he would face the man he had challenged. The room was small, quiet. A table, 2 chairs, a single window with the glass blown out, through which the smell of smoke still drifted in from the streets below. It was, in every way, the opposite of the battlefield outside. They brought von Klauer in and left him standing. Patton was already there, seated, unhurried, studying a map with the focused calm of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be. He didn't look up immediately. He let the silence settle, let it fill the room and press against the walls. When he finally raised his eyes, he took his time. He looked at the man in front of him the way a surgeon looks at a wound. Not with anger, not with contempt, but with the cold, precise attention of someone assessing damage that did not have to happen. Von Klauer stood straight. It was, by that point, the only thing he had left. Patton spoke first. His voice was level. He said that he had seen the German soldiers fight, that he understood what it meant to hold a position under pressure, to stand when every instinct was telling a man to run. He had spent his life demanding exactly that from his own men. He paused. Then his tone shifted. Not louder, not sharper, but something colder moved into it, the way temperature drops before a storm. He said that courage was a specific thing, that it had a definition, and that what had happened in Aschaffenburg did not meet it. Courage, he said, was not the refusal to accept reality. It was not the willingness to spend other men's lives on an outcome that was decided before the first shot was fired. It was not blind obedience, dressed up in the language of duty and honor to make it easier to give an order that should never have been given. What von Klauer had done, what he had chosen, standing in that room with Patton's ultimatum in front of him, was not the decision of a soldier. It was the decision of a fool. He said the word without heat, without theater. He said it the way a man states a fact he has already confirmed from multiple sources and no longer considers open to debate. Hundreds of men, German and American both, were dead for a city that was always going to fall, for an order issued by a man in a bunker who would be dead within weeks, for pride that had been mistaken at some point for principle, and von Klauer would carry every one of those deaths for the rest of his life. The room was absolutely silent. Von Klauer said nothing. There was no reply available to him, no argument that didn't collapse the moment it was formed, no defense that didn't prove the charge. Patton looked at him for a moment longer, Then he looked away, back to his maps, back to the war that was still moving forward, without pause. "Get him out of my sight." When the last shots were fired and the smoke began to clear, what remained of Aschaffenburg told its own story. Entire city blocks had ceased to exist. Streets that had stood for centuries were now channels of rubble. The bridges von Klauer had been ordered to defend were damaged beyond immediate use. The very infrastructure Patton needed, degraded by the battle fought to protect it. The civilians who emerged from their basements after 6 days did not walk out into a liberated city. They walked out into a ruin. The final accounting was brutal and simple. Hundreds of American soldiers killed or wounded, thousands of German soldiers dead, captured, or missing. A historic Bavarian city functionally destroyed, and the strategic outcome, Patton's advance continuing into Germany, was always inevitable. Every life spent inside those walls had been spent on borrowed time that was never going to be repaid. Patton understood the weight of what Aschaffenburg represented. He also understood how to use it. He ensured that reports of the battle, the cost, the destruction, the absolute futility of the resistance reached German commanders still holding positions further along the Allied line of advance, not as propaganda, as evidence, as a precise and unambiguous demonstration of what the mathematics of continued resistance looked like when the calculation was finally complete. The message was not complicated. This is what it costs. This is what you get. Choose accordingly. In the weeks that followed, city after city made a different choice. Commanders who might have issued their own fortress orders looked at what remained of Aschaffenburg and surrendered without a shot. Thousands of lives, German and American both, were saved not by more fighting, but by the decision to stop. The contrast between the two men could not have been more complete. Patton had built his entire philosophy around a single conviction, that the purpose of fighting was to win, and that winning meant making decisions, not deferring them. He was aggressive, even reckless by some measures, but his aggression was always pointed at an outcome. He spent lives only when spending them meant something. Von Klauer had fought without that anchor. He had followed orders because orders were the structure inside which his identity existed. When the orders stopped making sense, he followed them anyway, because the alternative was to think for himself, and that was the one thing his career had never required of him. Courage without wisdom, it turned out, was not a virtue. It was a mechanism for producing tragedy at scale. The most decorated generals in history are not remembered simply for how hard they fought. They are remembered for knowing when and why the fighting had to stop. Patton knew, and in the end, the most shocking words he spoke to that German general were not about victory. They were about the cost of refusing to accept defeat.